83 miles north of the Arctic Circle, the Alaskan town of Kivalina sits on the southern tip of a long barrier island. Almost all of the 400 residents are indigenous Inupiat, who hunt bowhead whales for subsistence and rely on the region's permafrost for protection from the ocean. Climate change has wreaked havoc on their way of life. The Arctic is the hottest it's been in 44,000 years, and temperatures are climbing at twice the global average. Hunting on the thinning ice has become dangerous, and as the permafrost melts, coastlines are at the mercy of storms which cause rapid erosion. Kivalina faces complete devastation. Scientists are certain that oil emissions have accelerated climate change. Since 1988, just 100 companies worldwide are responsible for over 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And Chevron, Exxon, BP, and Shell are 4 of the 6 largest emitters in history. In their search for relocation funds, therefore, it should have been easy for Kivalina to get help from some branch of government. But Kivalina knocked on all possible doors and no one answered. Local and state-level agencies charged with assisting displaced populations simply didn't have the funds.
I do not believe that there will be funds available all at one time. We just continue seeing how far the need is and how far the funding will take us. This may take decades.
Do communities have that much time?
I don't know.
In the state legislature, funds were choked off due to political capture by oil and gas companies, which generate 1/3 of Alaska's jobs and 90% of the state's revenue. So Kivalina turned to federal court, seeking damages from Exxon and 15 other energy companies for their role in climate change. But there was a roadblock here too. Courts could easily justify not intervening on the grounds that regulating air pollution was the job of the EPA under the Clean Air Act. Kivalina's lawyers attempted to bypass this obstacle by bringing a public nuisance claim under federal common law. Professor Douglas Kaiser of Yale Law School calls this effort the best attempt to date to pass through the narrow needle of climate change liability. In tort parlance, Kivalina suffers from a signature disease, since the people of Kivalina could have continued to inhabit their village for hundreds of years in a world without human-induced warming. Nevertheless, the Court of Appeals dismissed the case, holding that Kivalina's claims were displaced by statute, even though the Clean Air Act didn't have any provision for damages. In effect, the court ensured that neither polluting corporations nor the federal government would ever pay damages to climate change refugees. This leaves us with the following question: who can help climate change refugees? Let's step back from Kivalina and look at the bigger picture. Our current framework, grounded in classical liberal doctrine, dooms most public risk claims to failure. Courts are fora for individuals to bring claims against one another, not to deter firms from jeopardizing the public. In courtroom battles waged against large corporations, the safety-seeking public is simply outflanked. To see this, consider the first 2 standing requirements. A plaintiff must prove that harms are realized or imminent, and the injury is particularized. In short, a tortfeasor is only liable for injuries that would not have happened absent that party's breach. This but-for test for standing is so narrow that even Kivalina's damages, which on their face do satisfy the test, were insufficient. This is troubling, since the potential for firms to collectively harm the public has only grown since tort law's inception. Our shifting economic reality has outgrown the tort system, which begs the question: what if we arm tort doctrine with tools to hold companies liable for generating these risks? What would these reforms look like? To start, recall Kivalina's hurdle. To establish causation, they had to show that an individual company is responsible for the harm suffered. Among others, Judge Pro of the Court of Appeals endorsed this view, holding that Kivalina lacked standing because it failed to allege facts that plausibly trace their injuries to energy companies. Emitters throughout the vast time frame of history, he explains, are undifferentiated in the global atmosphere. This numerosity hurdle effectively means that when everyone is to blame, no one is to blame. But our world is now littered with risks generated from collective industry action. And we have seen this move to dismiss causation before. This is why, at a minimum, we propose a causation standard that expands industry liability while remaining tethered to its doctrinal moorings. If an industry causes harm collectively, market share should proxy for any single firm's causal role. For Kivalina, allocating responsibility under this reform would be quite straightforward. Companies would simply pay in proportion to their emissions. Let us now consider a less incremental reform, one that radically breaks with classical doctrine. Traditionally, firms are liable for realized harms, but when agents act, there is always a range of possible outcomes. Different shins may respond differently to the same kick. These uncertain outcomes flowing from firms' decisions are high stakes as compared to decisions by individuals. To ensure that firms take stock of potential harms that they may cause, we propose a liability rule that induces firms to internalize social costs and gives them incentives to avoid risky acts. Simply put, since the decisions we seek to influence are made before harms are realized, liability must track harms in expectation. Notice that if all claims were brought independent of the level of realized damages, or the time lapse between an act and resulting damages, liability based on realized harm would automatically track harm in expectation. But that's not the world we live in. Under the current regime, claims are only brought when realized damages are high enough to justify legal costs. And even when damages are high enough in the long run, long latency periods often preclude claims from being brought today or ever. Consequently, too few cases are brought in the current system. As the gap between public harm and legal liability grows, courts have been forced to grapple with the added stress, albeit in roundabout ways. Instead of skirting around the edges, by allowing courts to compel payment of damages in expectation, we attempt to address the problem head-on. This would serve the dual function of deterring risky behavior and remedying future harms. These reforms cannot reverse the harms already in motion, but they may reduce the imminence and depth of the devastation from climate change. Today, it is a small village in Alaska, but Kivalina is only the tip of the iceberg.
Why don't somebody think we're humans too? I wish somebody could think that way.